The night was unusually quiet in the small suburb of Millbrook, the kind of quiet that makes every little sound seem more noticeable than usual. Officer Chen had been with the police department for 15 years, and he knew these peaceful moments often came right before something unexpected. The dashboard clock showed 11:47 p.m. as he drove down Oak Avenue, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the autumn fog. He'd just finished his coffee, his third cup of the night, when the radio crackled to life. Unit 247, we've got a report of strange noises coming from 1462 Pine Street. Caller says they've been hearing scratching sounds and what might be crying. Can you check it out? Ken reached for the radio, suppressing a yawn. 10-4 dispatch, I'm about 5 minutes out. As he turned his car toward Pine Street, memories of similar calls flooded his mind. Usually, these late-night noise complaints turned out to be raccoons in trash cans or tree branches scraping against windows. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the mention of crying, or maybe it was just his gut instinct, the kind you develop after spending thousands of nights on patrol. Pine Street was one of those neighborhoods that told the story of changing times. Once proud family homes now stood in various states of repair. Some were well-maintained, with neat gardens and fresh paint. Others, like number 1462, had clearly seen better days. The old Victorian house loomed before him, its weathered blue paint peeling like old wallpaper. Dead leaves skidded across the overgrown front yard, dancing in the beam of his flashlight. The windows were dark, most of them covered with plywood, but one on the second floor remained uncovered, reflecting the moonlight like a watchful eye. Chen parked his patrol car and called in his location to dispatch. The engine ticked as it cooled, and in the silence, he could hear what the caller had described, a faint scratching sound, followed by something that might have been crying, or might have been the wind. It was hard to tell. He stepped out of his car, and the ground crunched under his boots. The smell of wet leaves and approaching rain filled the air. His hand instinctively rested on his flashlight as he approached the house, each step measured and careful on the uneven path. The porch steps groaned under his weight, a sound that seemed to echo through the empty street. Chen had learned long ago that these moments required all his senses. He paused, listening. The scratching sound was clearer now, definitely coming from somewhere below his feet. His radio buzzed softly with routine chatter from other units across town, a drunk driver on Main Street, a false alarm at the mini-mart. But here, on this lonely porch, time seemed to slow down. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it what he now clearly recognized as whimpering. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't raccoons. It was distinctly human. Ken clicked his radio. Dispatch, I'm hearing what sounds like someone in distress. Going to investigate further. He pulled out his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the darkness. As he moved around the side of the house, the beam caught something. Fresh scuff marks on the ground leading toward the crawl space access panel. The panel was slightly ajar, a rusty padlock hanging broken from its latch. Chen crouched down, his knees protesting the movement. The whimpering stopped abruptly, replaced by a hushed whisper he couldn't quite make out. "Police officer," he announced, his voice firm but gentle. "Is someone down there? I'm looking to help." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by what sounded like a child trying to stifle a cough. Chen's heart rate picked up. In 15 years of service, he'd learned that sometimes the most important calls weren't the dramatic ones with sirens blazing. They were quiet moments like this, where someone's whole world might be hanging by a thread. He reached for his radio again, this time keeping his voice low. "Dispatch, I'm going to need additional units at this location. Possible subjects in the crawl space, at least one may be a juvenile." As he waited for acknowledgement, he kept his flashlight beam steady on the opening, noticing now the small details he'd missed at first glance. Fresh footprints in the dirt, a candy wrapper that couldn't have been more than a day old. The wind picked up, bringing with it the first drops of rain. Chen knew that whatever he was about to discover in that crawl space would change not only his night, but possibly the lives of whoever was hiding beneath this old house. He'd seen enough in his career to know that sometimes the most heartbreaking discoveries came on the quietest nights in the most unexpected places. What he didn't know yet was that this call would become one of those moments that reminded him exactly why he'd chosen this path 15 years ago, a moment that would stay with him long after his badge was retired. The rain was starting to fall more steadily now, creating a gentle patter on Officer Chen's uniform as he waited for backup. His flashlight beam remained fixed on the crawl space opening, where just moments before he'd heard the unmistakable sounds of human movement. The old Victorian house creaked above him, its weathered boards shifting in the growing wind. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their tires crunching quietly on the wet gravel. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson approached silently, their own flashlights adding to the illumination of the scene. They'd worked with Chen long enough to read his body language. This wasn't just another routine call. "What have we got?" Rodriguez whispered, crouching down beside Chen. "At least one child down there," Chen replied softly. "Maybe more. They're trying to stay quiet, but I heard coughing." Thompson circled around to the other side of the house, checking for additional access points. The beam of his flashlight revealed several small items scattered near the foundation, a child's sock, an empty juice box, signs of recent human presence. Chen leaned closer to the crawl space opening, keeping his voice gentle and steady. "We know you're down there. Nobody's in trouble here. We just want to make sure you're safe." He paused, letting his words sink in. "It's starting to rain pretty hard, and it's getting cold. We can help." The silence that followed was broken by a soft whisper, too quiet to make out the words, followed by what sounded like someone shushing another person. Chen glanced at Rodriguez, who nodded encouragingly. Sometimes patience was the most important tool they had. "I'm going to sit right here," Chen continued, settling himself more comfortably on the wet ground. "My name's Officer Chen. When you're ready to talk, I'm ready to listen. No rush." He clicked off his flashlight, leaving just the softer illumination from his colleagues' lights. Sometimes, bright lights could feel threatening, and right now, building trust was crucial. The rain continued to fall, creating small puddles around them. Chen could feel the water seeping through his uniform pants where he sat, but he didn't move. In situations like these, showing commitment meant everything. He'd learned that lesson early in his career. Sometimes people needed to see that you were willing to be uncomfortable right alongside them. Minutes ticked by. Thompson radioed in quietly, requesting a child services worker to be on standby. The dispatcher acknowledged, her voice barely a whisper in their earpieces. They all knew that whatever they found here would need careful handling. A sudden gust of wind sent a plastic bag tumbling across the yard, and from beneath the house came a startled gasp, followed by distinct movement. The sound of something metallic being knocked over echoed in the cramped space. "It's okay," Chen reassured quickly. "Just the wind. Nothing to worry about." He paused, then added, "You know, my daughter used to be scared of storms too. We made up a game, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder to see how far away it was." There was a slight shuffling sound, then a small voice, barely audible. "How old is your daughter?" Chen's heart leaped at this first real contact, but he kept his voice casual. "She's in college now, but she still calls me every time there's a big storm." He smiled, though they couldn't see it. "Old habits die hard, I guess." More movement closer now. A beam of light caught a small hand gripping the edge of the crawl space opening, then quickly withdrawing. Chen nodded to Rodriguez, who took a few steps back, giving the space more breathing room. "You must be really cold down there," Chen continued conversationally. "I've got some warm blankets in my car. And I think Officer Rodriguez here might have some hot chocolate in his thermos." Rodriguez nodded, playing along perfectly. A face appeared briefly in the opening. A child, couldn't be more than 12, with eyes that held far too much worry for someone so young. Then it disappeared again, followed by more whispered consultation from within. Chen knew this moment was crucial. These weren't criminals hiding from the law. These were scared people who'd run out of options. His job wasn't to enforce in this moment, but to help. To show that sometimes the uniform meant safety rather than threat. The rain was falling harder now, and water was starting to trickle into the crawl space. Chen could hear someone coughing more frequently, a wet, concerning sound that made his decision easier. "Listen," he said firmly but kindly, "that cough doesn't sound good, and this rain isn't going to stop anytime soon. Whatever's going on, whatever brought you here, we can figure it out together. But right now, I need to make sure you're all safe and healthy. Can we start with that?" There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of rain and distant thunder. Then slowly the face appeared again. This time it stayed. Two small hands gripped the edge of the opening, and Chen could see now that they were trembling, from cold, from fear, or both. "You promise?" The voice was small but clear. "You promise you'll help?" Chen leaned forward slightly, making sure his face was visible in the dim light. "I promise, and I take my promises very seriously." What happened next would stay with all three officers for years to come, a reminder of why they'd chosen this profession in the first place. Because sometimes, in the middle of a rainy night, behind an abandoned house, you got the chance to be exactly what someone needed, not just an officer of the law, but a bridge back to safety, a hand reaching out in the darkness, offering not judgment but help. The next few moments unfolded like a scene from a dream. First came the young girl, her clothes dirty and damp from the crawl space floor. Officer Chen helped her out carefully, noticing how she winced slightly as she moved. Rodriguez immediately wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders, while Thompson radioed for medical support, his voice low and steady. But they all knew this wasn't the end. The girl kept looking back at the crawl space, her eyes filled with worry. Chen could hear more movement inside, and then came the sound that would break his heart. A baby's whimper, followed by a mother's gentle hushing. "It's okay," the girl whispered back into the darkness. "They really do want to help." She turned to Chen, her eyes suddenly older than her years. "My little brother's sick. He's been coughing all day." Chen nodded, keeping his expression calm despite the concern building in his chest. "We've got an ambulance coming, just to make sure everyone's okay." He moved closer to the opening again. "Ma'am, we need to get your little one checked out. Please, let us help." There was a pause, then rustling. A woman emerged slowly, cradling a toddler wrapped in what looked like an old sweater. The child's cough was worse now, a wet, rattling sound that made all three officers exchange worried glances. Behind them, they could hear the distant wail of approaching sirens. As Thompson helped the woman stand, Chen got his first real look at their situation. The mother couldn't have been more than 30, but exhaustion had carved deep lines around her eyes. Her clothes were clean but worn, suggesting someone who'd tried to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances. The toddler in her arms looked about 2 years old, his cheeks flushed with what was probably fever. "I'm sorry," she whispered, swaying slightly on her feet. "I didn't know where else to go." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Rodriguez quickly stepped forward to support her other side. The ambulance arrived then, its red and white lights painting the old house in alternating colors. 2 paramedics approached efficiently but gently, already assessing the situation. Chen watched as they took the toddler's temperature, 102.4 degrees. High enough to be concerning, especially given their living conditions. "How long have you been under there?" Chen asked softly as the paramedics began their work. He kept his tone conversational, non-judgmental. 3 days in this house, the mother replied, watching anxiously as they checked her son's breathing. "Before that, we were in the old warehouse district, but it wasn't safe there." She hugged herself tightly, the blanket Rodriguez had given her hanging loose around her shoulders. The girl, who they now knew was 12, stood close to her mother, one hand clutching the woman's jacket. "Mom tried to find a shelter," she explained, her voice stronger now. "But they were all full, and we couldn't go back." She stopped abruptly, looking up at her mother as if afraid she'd said too much. Chen understood what wasn't being said. He'd seen it too many times before. Families fleeing impossible situations, choosing uncertainty over known dangers. His throat tightened as he watched the paramedics load the toddler into the ambulance, his mother climbing in beside him, still apologizing, still afraid they were somehow in trouble. The girl hesitated at the ambulance steps, looking back at Chen. "You're not going to separate us, right?" The fear in her voice was raw, real. "Because last time the police came, they said." "No," Chen interrupted firmly, his decision already made. "No one's separating anyone tonight." He shared a look with his fellow officers, who nodded in agreement. This wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about protecting a family who'd run out of options. As he watched the ambulance pull away, its lights cutting through the rain that was still falling, Chen felt the full weight of what they'd discovered. Under that house, in the cold and dark, had been a family holding onto each other with everything they had. They hadn't chosen that crawl space. Life had pushed them there, one impossible decision at a time. Rodriguez was already on the phone with social services, explaining the situation. Thompson had gone back to the crawl space to retrieve what few belongings the family had: a backpack, some food wrappers, a stuffed animal that had seen better days. Each item told part of their story, and Chen found himself cataloging them not just as evidence, but as pieces of a life interrupted. The rain was easing now, but Chen barely noticed. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what needed to happen next. This family needed more than just one night's help. They needed a path forward, a way to rebuild. And standing there in the growing puddles, watching the ambulance's taillights disappear around the corner, he made himself another promise. This wouldn't be just another call, just another report to file. This would be where things changed for them. Because sometimes, he reminded himself, the real work of being a police officer wasn't about enforcement at all. It was about being there at the right moment, when someone needed not a uniform, but a human being who could help them find their way back to hope. The hospital waiting room buzzed with its usual late-night activity, but Officer Chen barely noticed. He sat in one of the hard plastic chairs, his uniform still damp from the rain, watching the mother and her 12-year-old daughter huddled together across from him. The toddler was being treated for bronchitis, nothing life-threatening, the doctors had assured them, but serious enough to require immediate attention. Chen had called his wife earlier, explaining he'd be late. She understood immediately. After 15 years of marriage to a police officer, she could hear in his voice when something had touched him deeply. "Do what you need to do," she'd said softly. "I'll keep your dinner warm." The girl had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, exhaustion finally winning out over anxiety. The mother remained awake, her eyes fixed on the treatment room doors, waiting for news about her son. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, Chen could see what the darkness had hidden. The subtle signs of someone who'd been running on nothing but determination for far too long. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked quietly, standing up. The mother started slightly, as if she'd forgotten he was there. She hesitated, then nodded. Chen noticed her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the paper cup a few minutes later. "Thank you," she whispered, careful not to wake her daughter. "Not just for the coffee, for being kind. The last few months, kindness has been rare." Chen sat down again, giving her space but staying close enough to talk. "Can you tell me how you ended up there?" he asked gently. "It might help us figure out the best way to help." She stayed into her coffee cup for a long moment, as if gathering her strength. "We had a life, you know. A normal life. I was a dental assistant. We had an apartment, the kids were in school." She trailed off, then took a shaky breath. "Then my husband started changing. The drinking got worse. The anger." Ken nodded, keeping his expression neutral but supportive. He'd heard variations of the story many times before, but it never got easier. "The night we left, he'd thrown a plate against the wall, right next to my daughter's head. He said it was an accident, but..." She closed her eyes briefly. "We waited until he passed out, grabbed what we could carry. I had some money saved up, but everything's so expensive now. The motels, the food, it went faster than I thought it would." Her daughter stirred slightly in her sleep, and the mother automatically smoothed her hair, a gesture of comfort that seemed more habit than conscious thought. "I tried the shelters. They were all full, said to call back in a few weeks. But we couldn't go back home. He would have." "You don't have to explain," Chen said softly. "You did what you had to do to protect your children." She nodded, wiping quickly at her eyes. "The kids have been so brave. My daughter, she's been like a second mother to her brother. She never complains, even when we had to sleep in that cold crawl space. She just holds his hand and tells him stories to keep him quiet." Chen felt his throat tighten. He thought of his own daughter, safe at college, probably studying for finals right now. The unfairness of it all, how some children had to grow up too fast, had to learn about survival when they should be learning about multiplication tables and science projects. The treatment room doors opened, and a nurse came out with the toddler in her arms. The little boy was awake now, his cheeks less flushed, his breathing easier. The mother stood up so quickly she almost spilled her coffee, but Chen caught the cup just in time. He's responding well to the treatment, the nurse explained, transferring the sleepy toddler to his mother's arms. We'd like to keep him overnight for observation, just to be safe. We've got a room ready. The mother's face fell. I don't have insurance. I can't afford. It's been taken care of. Chen interrupted quietly. He'd made some calls while they were waiting, reached out to a hospital social worker he knew. Sometimes, being a police officer for 15 years meant knowing exactly who to call, which strings to pull. The mother looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing all this?" Ken thought about how to answer. He thought about his own family, about the thin line between security and crisis that so many people walked. He thought about his sister, who'd once found herself in a similar situation, though she'd been lucky enough to have family to turn to. "Because this job isn't just about enforcing laws," he said finally. "It's about helping people find their way back when they've lost everything else. And tomorrow morning, we're going to start working on that. There's a domestic violence advocate I know, and a housing assistance program that might have some emergency options. It won't be easy, but you won't have to do it alone anymore." The girl stood then, waking up to find her brother back and safe. Her smile, the first real smile Chen had seen from her, transformed her whole face, making her look her age again. She reached out to touch her brother's hand, and the toddler grabbed her finger, holding on tight. Chen watched this small moment of joy, this tiny victory in what would be a long journey back to stability. He knew there would be challenges ahead, paperwork to file, systems to navigate, trust to rebuild. But for now, in this hospital waiting room in the middle of the night, a family that had been literally underground a few hours ago was starting to see a way forward. His radio crackled, another call, another situation that needed attention. But before he left, he made sure they had his direct number, made sure they knew they weren't alone anymore. Because sometimes, he knew, the most important part of the job wasn't the dramatic rescues or the high-speed chases. Sometimes it was simply being there, being the person who stopped, who listened, who cared enough to help rebuild what life had broken. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm. Officer Chen sat at his desk, his third coffee of the day growing cold beside him as he made phone calls. His shift had technically ended hours ago, but this wasn't about the job anymore. This was about following through on a promise. "Yes, I understand the waiting list is long," he said into the phone, rubbing his tired eyes. "But we have children involved and a documented domestic situation." He listened for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Thank you. Yes, I can have them there at 2 o'clock. As he hung up, his sergeant stopped by his desk. The older man had known Chen long enough to recognize when a case had gotten under his skin. "How's the family from last night?" Chen leaned back in his chair, stretching his stiff muscles. "The little boy's doing better. Hospital's keeping him one more day just to be safe." But he gestured at the stack of papers on his desk. "The system isn't making it easy. Every shelter's full, wait lists everywhere. They need more than just a temporary fix." The sergeant nodded thoughtfully. "You know, my wife's church runs that transitional housing program on Oak Street. Let me make a call." And so it went throughout the morning, one call leading to another, one person knowing someone who might be able to help. Chen's colleagues stopped by his desk periodically, offering suggestions, connections, resources. Word had spread through the department about the family found beneath the old Victorian house, and it had touched something in all of them. Around noon, Chen drove back to the hospital. He found the mother in her son's room, reading a donated children's book to both her kids. The girl sat cross-legged on the end of the hospital bed, while the toddler, looking much better, played with a small toy car one of the nurses had given him. "Good news," Chen said after greeting them. "We've got some appointments set up for this afternoon. Housing assistance, legal aid, and there's a support group that meets twice a week." He watched their faces carefully as he continued. "It's not going to be instant, but it's a start. And the church down on Oak Street has a transitional housing program. They have a 2-bedroom unit opening up next week." The mother's hands trembled as she set down the book. "A real place to live," she whispered, as if afraid saying it too loudly might make it disappear. "But we don't have any money for rent." "The program covers the first 3 months," Chen explained. Gives you time to find work, get back on your feet. They've got a job training program too and childcare assistance. He smiled at the girl, who was listening intently. And they're in the East Side School District. Good schools there. The girl's eyes lit up at the mention of school, though she tried to hide it. Chen had noticed how she kept eyeing the books the nurses brought, how she worked on the word puzzles in the magazines left in the waiting room. A kid who loved learning, forced to put education aside while survival took priority. I know it's overwhelming, Chen continued, pulling up a chair. So we're going to take it one step at a time. First appointment is at 2 o'clock with the housing coordinator. I can drive you there, and my wife's bringing over some clothes she picked up this morning. Nothing fancy, just some basics to get you started. The mother started to protest, but Chen held up his hand. Let people help. That's what community is supposed to be about. He watched as she absorbed this, saw the moment when something shifted in her expression. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but maybe it was the beginning of believing that hope was possible. The toddler roomed his toy car across the hospital blanket, making engine noises that turned into giggles when his sister joined in with her own car noises. It was such a normal moment of childhood play that it made Chen's throat tight. These kids deserved every chance to just be kids again. You know, he said, keeping his voice casual, my sister went through something similar about 10 years ago. He hadn't planned to share this, but something told him it might help. She had 2 kids, no place to go. Scared to ask for help because she thought everyone would judge her. Now she runs a support group for other women. Sometimes the hardest stories have the most important endings. The mother looked at him then, really looked at him, perhaps seeing for the first time not just the uniform but the person wearing it. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up back under that house, she admitted quietly. That all this help isn't real. It's real, Chen assured her. And yeah, there will be hard days ahead. Paperwork and interviews and rebuilding takes time. But you did the hardest part already. You got your kids out, kept them safe, stayed together. The rest? We'll figure it out step by step. Outside the hospital room, life went on. Doctors making rounds, nurses changing shifts, other families facing their own challenges. But in this room, something important was happening. A family that had been literally and figuratively in the darkness was starting to see light again. Trust was being rebuilt, not just in the system, but in the basic goodness of people. Chen's phone buzzed, another resource, another possibility to add to the growing network of support. As he made notes, he glanced at the family. The mother was back to reading, her voice stronger now. The girl was teaching her brother to make the car jump over imaginary obstacles, their laughter a reminder that joy can survive even the hardest circumstances. Sometimes, Chen thought, the real story isn't in the dramatic moment of rescue. It's in what happens after, the quiet work of rebuilding, the small victories that add up to changed lives. And sometimes being a police officer meant being part of those stories, not just for one night, but for as long as it took to make sure the story had the right ending. 6 months had passed since that rainy night beneath the old Victorian house. Officer Chen stood in front of a small apartment building, remembering how different things had looked half a year ago. The morning sun was bright, warming the early spring air as he walked up to Unit 12B, carrying a small gift bag. He could hear laughter from inside even before he knocked, the unmistakable sound of children playing. When the door opened, he almost didn't recognize the 12-year-old girl. Her hair was neatly braided, her clothes clean and new, but the biggest change was in her eyes. The wariness was gone, replaced by the kind of light that belongs in a child's face. "Officer Chen," she exclaimed, then turned to call into the apartment. "Mom, Officer Chen is here." The apartment was small but tidy, filled with second-hand furniture that had been lovingly arranged to make a real home. Drawings covered the refrigerator, the kind of ordinary childhood artwork that spoke volumes about how far they'd come. The toddler, now healthy and energetic, was playing with blocks on a colorful rug. The mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked years younger than she had that first night, standing tall now with a confidence that came from rebuilding her life piece by piece. "Just in time," she said, smiling. "We were about to have some cake." The girl just got her report card. She gestured proudly to a paper displayed prominently on the counter, straight A's, despite having missed almost half a year of school. Chen set down the gift bag, just some books he picked up, knowing how much the girl loved to read. "I can't stay long," he said, "but I wanted to drop these off. And to tell you about a job opening at the community center. They're looking for someone to help run their after-school program." The mother's eyes lit up. She'd recently completed a job training program and had been working part-time at a local diner. "Really? I've been hoping to find something where I could work with kids." "The director there already knows your story," Chen said. "She's impressed with how you've handled everything. The hours would work better with the kids' schedules too." The girl had settled on the floor with her brother, helping him stack blocks into an increasingly wobbly tower. It was such a normal scene, the kind Chen saw in his own home, in homes across the city. But he knew how close this family had come to losing everything, how easily their story could have gone another way. "You know," the mother said quietly, watching her children play, "I keep thinking about that night. How afraid I was when we heard someone above us. How sure I was that no one would understand, that we'd be judged for where we ended up." She turned to Chen. "But you didn't judge, you just helped." Chen thought about how many times he'd driven past that old Victorian house since then. The city had boarded it up properly now, but he never passed it without remembering. "Sometimes people just need someone to see them," he said, "really see them, not just their circumstances." The girl looked up from her block tower. "I told my teacher about you," she said, "for our essay about heroes. She said I should read it at the school assembly next week." She blushed slightly. Would you maybe come?" Chen felt something catch in his throat. In 15 years of police work, he'd received commendations, medals, official recognition. But somehow this meant more, this simple invitation from a child who'd learned to trust again. "I'd be honored," he said. The toddler chose that moment to knock over the block tower, sending pieces scattering across the floor. But instead of crying, he laughed, and his sister laughed with him. They immediately started rebuilding, working together to make something new from the fallen pieces. Chen watched them, thinking how much that simple act reflected their whole journey. Sometimes things fell apart, but with help, with patience, with people who cared, you could always rebuild. "Oh," the mother said suddenly, "I almost forgot to tell you. I started volunteering at the women's shelter on weekends, just a few hours, helping new families get settled in. I remember how scary those first days are, how much it means to have someone say, 'I understand, I've been there.'" And there it was. The full circle moment that made all the late nights, all the phone calls, all the pulled strings worth it. A family that had needed help was now strong enough to help others. The cycle of kindness continuing, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The girl had pulled one of the new books from the gift bag and was showing her brother the pictures. "Can we read it tonight?" she asked her mother. "At bedtime?" Of course, her mother answered, and the normalcy of that simple exchange. A family looking forward to bedtime stories in their own home, in their own beds, was perhaps the most beautiful part of all. Chen's radio crackled. Another call, another situation that needed attention. As he stood to leave, the mother touched his arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "not just for that night, but for showing us how to believe in good things again." Walking back to his patrol car, Chen thought about all the reports he'd filed over the years, all the calls he'd responded to. Some had happy endings, some didn't. But this one reminded him why he'd become a police officer in the first place. Because sometimes, in the darkest moments, all people needed was someone to shine a light, to show them the way back to hope. And if he could be that person, even once in a while, then every long night, every difficult moment, every challenge was worth it. As he drove away, he could see the family in his rearview mirror, standing in their doorway, waving goodbye. A family that had gone from hiding in darkness to standing proudly in the light. And in the end, that was the real story, not just the rescue, but the renewal. Not just the helping hand, but the hearts that learned to hope again.